Hello and welcome to another episode of our global roundtable with some of the finest minds in the world, commenting, analysing, and just generally talking about the great events that are going on in the world at the moment from the various News Corp stable of News Corp companies. We're going to be talking today about the US election and probably getting in some other conversation, some other aspects of the conversation too. I'm delighted to be joined this week by Kim Strassel, my colleague on the Wall Street Journal editorial page and columnist, author of the Potomac Watch column. From London, by Daniel Finkelstein, columnist and commentator for The Times, among his long and extraordinarily successful career. That's where he's coming from right now. And from Australia, where it's very early in the morning, so we're very grateful to him for being with us again. Greg Sheridan, foreign affairs commentator, long-standing columnist, commentator, editor, reporter from Australia, from Sydney. So thank you all for being with us this week. Let me get straight into it. This week, our topic is the US election. We are 4 months away, just a little bit over 4 months away from the US presidential election, but we've had some interesting developments on that subject in the last few days. Of course, we'll all be aware of the debate, the first presidential debate that took place last week between Donald Trump and Joe Biden. To say that it was a calamity for the incumbent president, Joe Biden, I say that without any partisanship whatsoever, but to say that would be an understatement. Karl Rove, one of our commentators, said on my podcast last week that it was the single worst performance in 60 years of watching presidential debates that he'd ever seen by any candidate, let alone a president. So that is rather shaken up the race to some extent. There have been a lot of calls in the last few days for Joe Biden to step aside. There's some pushback from the White House saying that he won't step aside. So I want to get straight in on this. And Kim Strassel, I'll come to you if I may. How do you see it? There is clearly a concerted effort going on. I call it the Save Joe Biden campaign, to keep Biden in place, to play down the awfulness of the performance last week. Is it going to work?
Well, this was certainly a reset moment in the campaign. And what's notable about that is it was a reset that Joe Biden asked for. Remember, his campaign issued this challenge. They asked for this to happen in an unprecedented early time frame because they wanted to try to shake up the race, get Joe Biden back in there. It is certainly reset it, but not in the way they were expecting it. The entire conversation now is about the president's competence. By the way, not just for another 4 years. We were even having a conversation in Washington, Republican calls to exercise the 25th Amendment and remove him from office because of fears over the next 6 months. This Save Biden campaign, I have to be honest with you, Jerry, I think it's actually going to succeed. I doubt very much he will not be the nominee in the end. And here's the thing and the thinking behind that is if you talk to Democrats, look, all of them completely honest with themselves. He's a bad candidate and they're very concerned about his prospects. And they know that he's slipped a step and is not up for the job. But they are thinking politically and what they worry about. And here's the deal. If they thought they had something better, they would have jettisoned already. But the chaos that is potentially going to be unleashed from having him step aside and having a free-for-all, they still do not know what to do with Kamala Harris, the vice president, who would be the natural successor. She's even less popular than Joe Biden. And the subsequent arguments over who it would be, if not her, and the problems that could have on core demographics if they do pass over the current vice president, I think they worry it would put them in an even worse situation than they are now. So combined with the fact that Joe Biden looks like he is going to cling to that position with every last bit of strength in his fingers, suggests that he's not going anywhere.
Just a quick follow-up on that, Kim. I'm sure that's right. A lot of people have said the same to me. What about if the polls, I mean, again, the polls haven't really moved very much at all for the last 18 months. Trump seems to have got a slight lead in the last week or two. If we were to see we haven't really seen any really reliable data yet because the debate was only on Thursday and we're recording this on Monday. But if we were to see a real deterioration in Biden's numbers in the next few days or week or so, do you think that you might have to revise that judgment that Biden stays on the ticket?
So I would actually point to a different number than just Joe Biden's popularity or approval. Look to see what happens to the other Democratic candidates in the Senate and in the House. One thing that's been remarkable is how well they have maintained a distance from the president and his own poor numbers. If you look at some of those races with Republicans, some of Democrats are actually really holding their own. They've got a pretty decent shot of winning some of those core races. If that begins to disintegrate, if his coattails begin to hurt them as well, and so you see his numbers going down and theirs, that's when you would see panic in the party and a potentially real movement to get rid of him.
Danny and Greg, you're both seasoned observers of American politics as well as politics in your own country. And I want to come to both of you. Danny, you first. Again, you're not only a seasoned observer of US politics, but you've also been sort of on the other side of the political media line, as it were, and advising a former prime minister, at least, in rather difficult political circumstances, not in a kind of a debate setting, but in a wider political circumstances. As you watched that debate, I don't know if you saw it, but I'm sure you saw I'm sure you saw enough of it to make an opinion. One of the things the Biden people are saying is, look, it was one debate, it was one night, he had a bad night. You don't judge whether someone's fitness for president on the basis of whether or not he's had a bad debate. How do you see? Give us again your sense of how you see the race right now, but particularly start off, if you would, with how you see that argument that, look, this was just a bad night. We can move on.
Well, if it was just a bad night and they can move on, then it will work as an argument. I think my experience probably teaches there's only a limited amount that you can persuade people is true if what they can see in front of their eyes shows them it isn't. And I can't imagine that Joe Biden's and his team are able to reassure people that it won't happen again. And I think it is really, a completely obvious losing position to hold. And for all, I think Kim's completely correct in all of the difficulties of removing him. My calculation would certainly be that those things are merely probabilistic, whereas it's almost certain if he stays on the ticket, this will become a bigger and bigger problem. And I find it hard to see how, coming as he is anyway from behind, and concerned as they were anyway about his chances of winning because of, for all sorts of reasons to do with the economy and demographics. Well, I can hardly see that if he carries on, it's going to be successful. So you almost have to take this risk. As I say, if you sit there as an advisor, it's so tempting to say the thing that everyone in the room wants to hear. And I wouldn't be surprised if around him he was being reassured that he was fine. Not out of a sense of sycophancy, that's wrong. It's more out of almost a sense of personal embarrassment that people have, not to say something to somebody's face that's so completely they so completely don't wish to hear, to someone that they like and respect. So they won't tell him, and as a result, the Democrats will keep on, driving towards the edge of the cliff, in my view.
Greg, we can't obviously discuss this discuss Biden in a vacuum. We have to discuss it in terms of his opponent, and as Biden always likes to say, don't judge me against what's perfect, judge me against what's the alternative. And I can't help but believe, Greg, I don't know if you think this too, that if anybody other than Donald Trump were running against Biden after that performance last week, and after, there was a poll at the weekend that showed that 72% of Americans think that Joe Biden won't be able to perform the functions of president for a second term. Anybody else other than Donald Trump, this election would be over, wouldn't it? I mean, it's Trump's own flaws that even keep this election even vaguely competitive.
Well, Jerry, I think that's broadly right. But on the other hand, I think we commentators both underestimate and overestimate and can never quite pick Trump quite right. I mean, he's a very dynamic character. Those rules suited him incredibly well because they reinforced the quality he lacks more than any other, which is self-discipline. And, Trump, actually, it's the first time ever you could say less was more. He didn't go bananas when Biden went incoherent. He just kind of looked, doleful and sagacious in a way. But look, I'd offer a couple of thoughts on the state of the campaign right now. Firstly, everything I know of Biden tells me he won't quit. And leaders have this insane self-belief, both successful leaders and leaders who ultimately fail. I had friends on George H.W. Bush's staff, and they were telling him he was going to lose to Bill Clinton. And his response was, well, look, who's won all these elections so far, you or me? And Biden has this sort of almost deranged self-belief, which is very, very stubborn. The other thing, though, is that means it's from here, it's Trump's to lose, and the main person who can beat Trump is Trump. But the Democrats now will be very sedulously searching for something else which changes the dynamic. So what could they possibly do? I mean, I'm not suggesting the New York judge is in the pay of the Democratic campaign, but does he now put Trump in jail? That would tear America apart and lead to gross strife and so on, but it would probably energize the anti-Trump vote as well as the pro-Trump vote. No one, it seems to me, is going to vote for Biden, but tens of millions of people still likely to vote against Trump. And I think Democrat strategists would be looking at what bomb can they explode, which changes and when you're losing, the final thought, when you're losing and losing badly, desperation, double or nothing bets have their appeal.
Yeah, Kim, Greg's point about sort of Biden's self-belief, and indeed all presidents' self-belief does remind me of, forgive me, I've used this phrase, this anecdote before, but I always remember John McCain famously saying the only known cure for presidential ambition is embalming fluid. And I sort of fear with Joe Biden we may be quite close to testing the actual literal quality of that claim. But do you think Greg's right that essentially that the only thing that can now actually defeat Donald Trump is Donald Trump himself?
Yeah, it's a really great point because step back as well too. I mean, we've talked so far in this about personality and the failings that Biden had on the debate stage in terms of losing to at that point, better debater. But let's not forget that he also lost to a better policy and ideas package as well too. And that is also fundamentally one of the Democrats' problems here at the moment. Biden's dealing with soaring inflation, interest rates, immigration problems. These are policies that they have adopted. They cut against the grain of a lot of what we've learned over the years from the Reagan years. Even some of Biden's predecessors had understood some of those lessons, like Clinton. We've now seen a very dramatic turn back to the left and progressive views. And that has resulted in an economy that is failing for a lot of people. Folks are just very angry at this administration and where they stand in life right now. And but the problem is Democrats don't have anything else, right? They cannot run on the issues. They tried Bidenomics. It didn't work. And so you saw an ad. This is first response from the Biden-Harris team today, in which they entirely had the focus on Donald Trump as a liar and as one of the instigators of insurrection. And, these are the kind of things that they're going to lean on to try to scare Americans out of voting for Donald Trump. Now, the question is, Donald Trump, does he help them in that? One of the reasons Trump helped himself so well in that debate is as Greg said and Danny said, he restrained himself. He kept himself from being erratic, crazy, saying things that would freak folks out. But he's got a lot of time from now until November, and he is an erratic person. So how does he handle himself on the campaign trail? But also, how does he handle him? I mean, in theory, we're still going to have another debate in September. Team Biden is looking at that, hopeful that it would be a chance for them to leave the last impression. We have better debate. Donald Trump is going to have to see if he can get through that one with the same level of restraint and attempting to look presidential.
Danny, I know the Biden, exactly as Kim says, it's not obviously just Biden's age. The issues, whatever one thinks of the merits of the policies, the issues Biden is way, way behind Trump, whether it's on price inflation, prices of the economy, on immigration, on crime, on national security. He's trailing Trump on all these issues by 10, 15 points. But whenever I've said this, whenever you talk about this with Democratic politicians and strategists, their claim all along has been, we're going to make our case on these issues. We can close the gap a little bit on them. But the deciding issue here will be the American people, do the American people want to elect an insurrectionist? Do they want to elect someone who tried to overturn the result of the last election, who engaged in extra constitutional activity, and frankly is a threat to democracy? It's pretty striking still at this point, as I say, with Trump's lead in the polls, not big, but still there. That message doesn't really, it certainly hasn't clinched the argument in ways that I think a lot of Democrats think it would, and maybe a lot of people overseas, I'm sure, think it would. What's your sense as they keep hammering that message with or without Biden for the next 3 months? How effective do you think it really will be with American voters?
Well, one of the things that we often talk about in Britain is how can it be that, and I've got friends who are Republicans who seem perfectly satisfied to look to stand behind someone who to the naked eye looks like someone who doesn't believe in democratic or legal norms, and then I always say to British people who fail to understand that, look at the demographics and look at the issues, and when you understand that, we in Britain concentrate on the eccentricities of the Republicans because it seems so alien to British political debate, but haven't focused on how far the Democrats have sometimes moved from where public opinion is, which explains a lot of election results. And one of the things that I was thinking of, if I was an advisor, going to your earlier question, to Biden, and I'd hit the buffers, I realized I wasn't going to be able to persuade him to resign. I think the thing that I would try next is try to get him to change his vice president. Because after all, what people are really doing if they vote for Biden is voting for both candidates on the ticket, right? And part of his problem is that Kamala Harris is so unpopular. And she's unpopular for exactly the reasons that we discussed, because she personifies the things that people, in a way that Joe Biden doesn't quite, the kind of policy and political issues which people are most unhappy with the Democrats about. So maybe in exactly the same way that when Roosevelt realized his powers were failing, he appointed Harry Truman, and we therefore didn't, the whole of Western politics would have been different if Henry Wallace had ended up being president instead. So I think it's the best second line. It's not the best thing they could do, but the best second line, and perhaps more practical, is that when he goes to the convention, Biden nominates somebody else, which he still has the ability to do.
Let's come on to that. I want to quickly talk about vice presidents on both sides. But Greg, just a wider question to you. As you look at obviously you look at what's happening in the US. We've just had these French elections this weekend, in which the National Rally, the right-wing party, the sort of anti-immigrant right-wing populist party, has come out top. Chance of it, we're going to see the second round next week. Don't know if they'll have enough seats to form a government, but they could be pretty close. We've seen it. We saw those European elections earlier this month. Last month actually, 1st of July now. With this again advances for parties like the AfD in Germany. Giorgia Meloni's Brothers of Italy party did well. As you look at this from a global perspective, which I know you very much take, Greg, is this? Is this all of a piece, or and what's driving it? What's driving both this embrace of these nationalist populist parties, but also to pick up on sort of Danny's point a little bit, maybe they're not quite so concerned about the kind of niceties of democracy and the kind of all those principles that supposedly sort of govern the way we've operated for the last 75 years. There seems to be a much more radical kind of sentiment around the world right now in many of these democracies.
Yeah, Jerry, that's an intriguing question. Certainly, in Asia generally prefers Republican presidents, and the Pacific is a Republican ocean, the Atlantic is a Democratic ocean, and on the whole, they weren't too unhappy with Trump last time. I mean, the Chinese didn't like him, but the rest of Asia was quite okay with him, and a lot of the sort of panic about democracy is pretty much lost on an Asian audience. In terms of Europe and North America and Australia, I'd say conventional politics, the old policy paradigm, looks exhausted and doesn't seem to be able to answer the problems of the moment. So some people are feeling neglected. Some people are quite paranoid. The whole society is absolutely addicted to transfer payments and just wants more and more money. I mean, it seems to me that no Western society, the United States, nor Britain, nor Australia, nor any of the West Europeans are doing a proper effort on defence, given the security challenges that we face. And that's really a question about resources. And each one of our countries is in deficit in budget terms. We're addicted to massive transfer payments, both in France, both the National Rally and the French and the left-wing alliance want to reverse Macron's very modest pension reforms. So there's clearly a right-left divide on cultural issues. There's clearly a right-left divide on uncontrolled illegal immigration. Australia had a distinctive experience here because we stopped illegal immigration largely, but that allowed us to increase legal immigration. But at the same time, the populists are just as unrealistic about budget deficits and the source of national growth and so forth as are the mainstream parties. Maloney has been a perfectly sensible, mainstream pragmatic leader, but indeed, if the populists get into government, the same thing will happen to them. They'll find there's no magic pudding, and they can't increase everyone's welfare, benefits and decrease taxes and balance the budget at the same time, which is what Trump promised in 2016. Without being too gloomy about it, I must say no Western society so far is coming to grips with these problems.
Kim, we've got an astonishing cascade of events with big political ramifications in the next few weeks. We just had the debate, of course, last week here in the US. We've got on July the 11th, Donald Trump is scheduled to be sentenced over the Manhattan in Manhattan over the Alvin Bragg case, the hush money paid to the porn star, the conviction there. Almost immediately after that, he's going to announce his vice presidential pick, and straight after that, we're going to have the Republican National Convention where he's going to be formally nominated, and he and his vice presidential pick will be nominated if he's able to go and he's not locked up in a New York prison cell, presumably. How do you see? Let's start with the. We don't know whether that judge is going to sentence Trump. God help us, as Greg said, there will be massive unrest probably in the US if he did. But with the vice presidential pick, he's obviously sounds like he's probably already picked his man. Seems likely to be a man. What's your feeling about that? Either about who it is or what he's looking for in that pick?
Well, there's what Trump's looking for, and then there's what he should look for. Traditionally, the wisdom is always that a candidate should choose someone that's going to win them an influential or important swing state, or help them with a particular voter demographic. This is why you've heard people talking about Tim Scott or Marco Rubio, given some inroads Republicans have been hoping to make with African American and Hispanic voters. My own argument is that Trump has a different weakness that the right kind of vice presidential candidate could counterbalance. And that is with moderate Republican and suburban voters. They've been his huge weakness in the last two cycles. And, that would argue for someone, these are voters who they like his economic policies. They are very uncertain about his character and behavior. They want someone that they feel would modulate against that. So, that would argue it's not going to happen for a Nikki Haley, for instance, or a Joni Ernst, the governor of Iowa, someone that is sort of widely admired, especially among women. I don't think he's going to go there. I think Trump wants someone that's more like him, that, is not necessarily going to offer him the pushback he had last time around, at least toward the end with Mike Pence and some of his other advisors. Apparently, also, he wants somebody who is shorter than he is. He does not like tall people.
And definitely has a higher golf handicap. I think we probably discovered that after
so
last week's debate.
It sounds right. I mean, the top contenders at the moment we're hearing are Marco Rubio or J.D. Vance. They're much more populist in the way he is. My own view is Doug Burgum would probably be the best of those choices. I think he does offer a little bit of that counterbalance. And, that was very important to Trump last time around with Mike Pence. People who felt uncertain, uncomfortable with Trump were reassured by Mike Pence.
Danny, on this topic, you've been keen follower of US politics for a long time. Vice presidential picks don't make a lot of, as Kim says, they make very little difference in the election. They obviously can make a difference in the longer term. Many of them go on to become presidents. Some of them do play an important role for the president in office. One thinks about Dick Cheney with George W. Bush, maybe Al Gore with Bill Clinton. What's your thought? I mean, again, do you think he should be looking for someone who gives people some sort of reassurance?
Lyndon Johnson was asked by Claire Booth Luce why would he leave the Senate, where he'd been the majority leader, in order to become vice president, and he said, "Well, sweetheart," I think he said, 1 in 4 presidents die in office. You've got to love them odds." Because you do have to wonder over who would want this job as Donald Trump's vice president, considering the last one, his own supporters put a noose outside, and they probably would have used it if they got hold of him. So I find it extraordinary that somebody like J.D. Vance, who at least appears on the surface of it to be at least literate, when I read his book, could, and quite politically insightful, could want this particular role. But I suppose it's their mods that does it. No, it won't probably make a huge amount of difference. It can probably bring you down, but it doesn't usually boost you up. Although obviously, in the Texan votes for Kennedy were probably pretty valuable. So the occasional state might play a role, and I suppose that Donald Trump might think about that.
Greg, feel free to weigh in either on Trump's vice presidential pick, but we can come back. We haven't talked much about Kamala Harris, Joe Biden's vice president. Danny talked a little bit about her, and it does seem to me that I had a really interesting conversation with a very senior Democrat who said to me, this was before the debate, actually, who said, the vice president never matters to people. They don't think about the vice president. He said, I do think there is a risk, however, that Kamala Harris does matter to people because they know now, and they've seen it certainly since last week's debate, they have even more reason to believe that a vote for Joe Biden is very, very plausibly a vote to put Kamala Harris in the Oval Office at some point in the next 4 years. And he was expressing concern about that and saying, that at the margin in a close election, that could make a difference. I mean, is that unfair to Kamala Harris? I mean, that seems to be, her approval ratings are even worse than Joe Biden's. And do you think Biden might fare any better by actually replacing her?
Well, I think Biden's choice of Kamala Harris was very rational and very shrewd and speaks in a way to the Biden mindset. So she ticked all the identity politics boxes. She was African American, she was also Asian, she was a woman, she was West Coast, everything. But also presidents have a tremendous predilection to choose mediocre vice presidents in the hope that no one will ever say this, if only we had the vice president. So Nixon chose both Spiro Agnew and Gerald Ford, thinking they were both such dunderheaded mediocrities that nobody could ever, in their right mind, think
FDR and Harry Truman. So
two of my three favorite presidents in the last century or more: Teddy Roosevelt, Harry Truman, and Ronald Reagan. Well, Teddy Roosevelt and Harry Truman were completely accidental presidents. Harry Truman was not only a haberdasher, he was a failed haberdasher. And he ended up being a great president. But Biden has kind of outsmarted himself in a way, although he's kept himself secure. As Kim was outlining earlier, one of the big problems with saying, leave Joe, is the logical successor is Kamala Harris. And it looks like it would be even harder for her. Just a thought on Trump's choice. Trump will have contradictory dynamics at work here. Pence was a brilliant choice for Trump, a brilliant choice. Helped solidify him with the evangelicals, but more than anything, the thought was, we like Trump for his rebellion, but we want some rational adult in the room. And when push came to shove on January 6th, Pence was a rational adult. Now, Trump doesn't want January 6th repeated, obviously, in the terms of his vice president defying him. But Trump probably has enough self-awareness to recognise that that's what he wants, a mediocre, stolid, but reassuring person. He doesn't want a mini-me. He doesn't want another Trump. He doesn't want anyone who competes for the limelight, who's very clever and so forth. He wants some stolid, reassuring person who. So the final thought is that although the vice president doesn't matter that much, it does affect the narrative of the president. And when you've got a president like Trump, for whom there is this great psychological doubt in the electorate, choosing a really steady hand as vice president. So I think that argues against J.D. Vance because he's too young, and more in favour of someone like Doug Burgum or Rubio. But Trump will, as ever, be caught in a conflict between his own egotistical mad desires and what is best to get elected. But he can be pretty ruthless. So I think we might get quite a sensible choice for vice president.
All right, we're almost out of time, but I'm going to give you one more question for each of you, a slightly different one for each of you. Kim, I'm going to start with you, and we're 4 months, as I say, just over 4 months to polling day. As I say, Trump seems to have this pretty, very slender lead in the national polls, maybe, just 1 percentage point, which hasn't moved much over the last few months. He has a more pronounced and apparently enduring lead in the key swing states, including, by the way, introducing some new swing states that Biden won comfortably in 2020, states like Minnesota and Virginia. So the electoral map really does seem to strongly favor Donald Trump at the moment. So my question to you, the next 4 months, what could change that? Obviously Biden, any more performances like last week by Biden presumably will make it worse. Is there anything that you'll be looking for, Kim, in the next few months that could change what seems to be a pretty well set pattern now in the presidential contest?
Well, the largest thing is just what Greg was saying, that Donald Trump does something to self-immolate. And that is always a possibility because this is Donald Trump. The other thing I think you need to watch for, and I believe we're beginning to get to a point where it'd be very hard to see this happen in time, it would have to happen soon, is if you saw some sort of economic turnaround where inflation dramatically dropped, maybe the Federal Reserve came in with a rate cut and brought interest rates down a little bit, bigger bounce in the stock market. I think it's unlikely. It takes time for those things to filter through the economic system to an extent that people feel them in their pocketbook. And I'm not quite sure, even though Democrats keep banking on this, that would really change. The one thing, though, I always warn Republicans, they are very, very good at shooting themselves in the foot. And they should not underestimate the powers of incumbency. Okay. I mean, you just don't know. We've had some very poor polling in recent years. So while those polls you cite are correct, Jerry, it's always possible something's being missed. Nationally, at least, there is, a very close and tight race. We have a couple of third-party contenders in this race, too. Robert F. Kennedy Jr., Jill Stein, the Green Party candidate. No one really knows yet who they're going to take voters from. The polls have been very mixed on that. Some suggest they draw, the RFK in particular draws voters away from Trump, but some have suggested Biden. So there's still a lot of uncertainty. And if Donald Trump goes into this thinking he's got it in the bag, that would be a big mistake.
Danny, very different question for you. We're going to have, barring something extraordinary and completely unexpected, we're going to have a change of government in the UK this week. By the weekend, Sir Keir Starmer will be Prime Minister at the head of a new Labour government. And then we're going to have, obviously, the US-UK relationship has always been very important, obviously more important for the UK than it is for the US. How is that relationship how are they going to handle that relationship? First of all, they're going to have Biden, or, kind of what may be left of the Biden administration for the next few months, and then possibly Trump back in the White House. How do you see, especially Britain being outside the EU, Starmer's obviously going to look for, closer accommodation with the EU. How does this new Labour government handle the prospect of a second Trump administration?
It's going to be very hard for them. The two things you have to understand about Keir Starmer are this. First, his whole life he has been quite left-wing. I mean, really, in American terms, very left-wing, really. And always, on every big issue to the left of me, on issues of security and defense and human rights and striking, all those things. But the second thing you need to know about him is he is a very considered, rational person and quite pragmatic. And that's why during his leadership, he's moved much closer towards the centre. He would definitely want to be seen as robust on defence issues, but not just for electoral reasons, but also because as he is asked to actually do things, he begins to think about them and slightly repents of his earlier positions on them. This means that I think he'll constantly be faced with two things. First, Trump will do things that will completely horrify him and all of his allies and say things that he cannot stand behind. And that will be his first instinct. And the second thing will be he'll think rationally and pragmatically. Britain is dependent on the United States and in its security relationships and in terms of its weaponry and in terms of what it wants to do in the international community. He is going to find this all very, very difficult. I think it'll be one of the most difficult aspects of his premiership. But to be fair, I think Trump being re-elected would be a problem for any president. And you were asking the question, will he be? And I was going to answer you, I'm not an actuary and I'm not a policeman, so how do I know?
Greg, final question for you. Give us the global perspective here. There was a lot of commentary after that debate here last week that the rest of the world must be looking on America, especially America's adversaries, China in particular, but Russia. Just me looking at America and thinking, rubbing their hands in glee and thinking, oh my God, it's led by a man who can't finish a sentence and doesn't know where he is, and he looks like he's going to be defeated by a man who, has certainly been erratic in the past, and the country on top of all of that is deeply, deeply divided. Is this election just confirming the views of a lot of people in the rest of the world that America is in a sort of, not in decline, then certainly in a deep, deep, deep funk right now? And is that an opportunity for America's adversaries, do you think?
Well, yes, it is. But, Jerry, I'd say my international outlook is really conditioned by Asia. And for Asia, two things are important about the Americans: trade policy and military policy. Trade policy is equally terrible under Biden or Trump. So neither of them offer anything good there. The repudiation of the Trans-Pacific Partnership and so on was a really dumb act of self-harm by the Americans. But nobody really likes the instability that Trump brings. But on the other hand, Biden is universally regarded as a weak president. The argument in favour of him on foreign policy is that he allows the American system to operate, and the American system remains very powerful and very competent. But the single most important American institution for Asia is the American military. And the military is always stronger under a Republican president, and it was stronger under Trump than it has been under Biden. I mean, I wish Americans would stop appointing land army generals to the defense secretary's job when the challenge overwhelmingly is a maritime challenge posed by China. But as I said to you before, overall, Trump disconcerted Asia when he talked about, was the South Korean alliance worth having, and he had his weird love affair with Kim Jong-un and so on. So, I mean, I feel about Trump the same as you, Jerry. I mean, I certainly wouldn't let him babysit my grandkids or anything like that. But nonetheless, he'll deliver a bigger military. He'll deliver a more robust America. He scares America's enemies. He also scares America's friends. But, one thing Asian wants, and Australia is very much an Orthodox East Asian nation in this respect, is we want a powerful America. And America's divisions at the moment are depressing, but I think the overall judgment in Asia would be America is likely to be more powerful under Trump than it is under Biden. So the Chinese would be happy for Biden to be re-elected, but everyone else in Asia, I think, will kind of think, yeah, well, Trump, he's bombastic, he has mistresses, he makes money out of real estate. How astonishingly unusual that would be in Asia. And, they'll say, okay, well, we can.
It's almost a prerequisite for a high office in Asia, isn't it?
Yeah, and final sort of 1 second anecdote. I was on a writers panel at the Jaipur Writers Festival with a New York Times guy and an Indian. And the New York Times guy wanted the Indian and me to join the American Civil War. Whereas our response was, no, he's the president of America. This was when Trump was president. He's the president of America. We have important national interests to prosecute, And actually, from our point of view, he's not too bad. We like his
Yeah.
attitude on China. We like his attitude on Pakistan. We like the fact that he's got a big military, and bilaterally, both for India and for Australia, he did a lot of good things. So I think there'll be less moral panic in Asia about Trump, and generally speaking, a feeling that America would be stronger, and Trump indeed might be calmer and more sensible in the second term than he was in the first.
Thanks, Greg. You summed it up very well there. The contest is talking about you wouldn't let Donald Trump babysit your grandkids. As the contest seems to be between a man you wouldn't let babysit your grandkids and a man you wouldn't give the keys to your car to because he probably wouldn't make it. Anyway, that was a wonderful conversation. Thank you all. Greg Sheridan of The Australian, Danny Finkelstein of The Times, and Kim Strassel of the Wall Street Journal. Thanks very much indeed for participating in another of the global roundtables. And we look forward to the next one. In the meantime, thanks for joining us. Goodbye.